Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Center for Migration Studies 2021 Virtual Academic and Policy Symposium. My name is Emma Winters, and I'm the Communications Manager at the Center for Migration Studies. Before we get started, I'd just like to go over a few housekeeping items so that you know how to participate today. At any time during the conference, you can share comments and ask questions in the Q&A box below the video player. And you can also contact CMS with any questions after the event by emailing cms@cmsny.org or tweeting at CMS New York. We will be recording the entire conference, and we will share the recordings with you after the event. Without further ado, I will turn it over to CMS's Executive Director, Donald Kerwin.
Well, thank you, Emma, and welcome participants to our event. Our intention in this event is to lift up the work of editors and authors from the International Migration Review, the Journal on Migration and Human Security, and other experts, and to provide a forum that bridges the academic, research, and public policy communities in our field. A participant at an earlier conference characterized this event as migration wonk heaven. And so welcome. It's not heaven, I know, but then at least to what we think will be a valuable 2 days. The theme of this year's symposium is Innovation in International Migration Research and Policy. Before I introduce Eric Schwartz, I wanted to thank our organizing committee, most of whom are moderating panels over the next 2 days. They are Jamie Winders, who will moderate the first panel discussion on data ethics in international migration. Jamie is the editor of the International Migration Review and professor of geography and director of the Autonomous Systems Policy Institute at Syracuse University. Jacqueline Pavillon, CMS's executive director, who oversees our growing research portfolio, will moderate our second session on the future of work in international migration. Susan Martin founded Georgetown University's Institute for the Study of International Migration, and she's the Donald G. Herzberg Professor Emeritus at Georgetown. She's also a CMS board member, we're happy to say, and she'll moderate our opening panel tomorrow, which will begin at 10 a.m. Eastern Time on innovations in forced migration policy and research. And I'll be moderating our last panel, again, starting tomorrow at 11:25 a.m. Eastern Time, titled The U.S. Immigration Debate, the Biden Administration's Agenda, Pending Bills, and Issues Receiving Insufficient Attention in the Public Debate. Let me also quickly thank CMS staff, particularly Melissa Katsouris and Emma Winters, who organized and are publicizing our event. We were hoping to start this symposium by placing it in the context really of our current moment, which is extraordinary in immigration policy. What are we seeing? Well, among other trends, we're seeing extraordinary levels of forced displacement in the world and large numbers of apprehensions and expulsions of persons seeking protection at the US-Mexico border. At the same time, we're seeing an impressive and positive consensus on migration policy and on refugees, as reflected in the global compacts, and a US administration that pledged to both undo its predecessor's handiwork and to build a better system than existed in the past in its stead. But juxtaposed to all of this is the extraordinary virulent hostility to this vision that's laid out in the compacts, to cooperation on anything but immigration enforcement, and to indifference at best to those seeking protection. We asked Eric Schwartz to talk on these issues based on his long and varied experience in and out of government and his bedrock commitment to refugee protection and to human rights. Eric has been the president of Refugees International since 2017. Prior to that, he served for 6 years as dean of the Hubert H. Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. In his long career of public service, he has held the positions of U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Population, Refugees, and Migration. He was the senior human rights and humanitarian official at the National Security Council, managing humanitarian responses to crises in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East and Europe. He served as UN Deputy Special Envoy for tsunami recovery after the 2004 Asian tsunami and he was staff consultant to the House Foreign Affairs Committee on Asian and Pacific Affairs. We're really delighted to have Eric join us today. He's going to speak for 15 minutes and then take questions for the remainder of our session, which will end about 25 minutes from now. And then we will turn the event over to our next panel. If you have questions for Eric, you can write him directly at Refugees International. We'll also be posting Eric's remarks and recording this entire symposium. So Eric, thank you for joining us.
Well, it's a real pleasure to join you, Don. Thank you so much. I'm going to be using a PowerPoint. Okay. Well, I want to thank you for the very kind and generous invitation for me to offer remarks. It's really a pleasure to address this gathering of experts, many of whom are or were teachers, colleagues, collaborators, and friends of mine. And I might add that a member of the CMS board was my immigration law professor some 40 years ago. So as I looked at the subject matter of today's session, I thought about many topical issues I might address and which have been the focus of the work of my organization, Refugees International, Afghan refugees and resettlement, the Northern Triangle and the Southern Border, the Secretary General's Blue Ribbon Panel Report on Internal Displacement, climate change and migration, and I'm happy to discuss any of these issues in the question and answer session. I expect you'll be discussing them as well. But I thought I'd try to take a step back and at least begin to reflect on an issue that has kind of consumed me over the course of a 35-year career. And that is the tension between aspiring and advocating for transformational change and coming to grips with the reality of incremental change, or even less than incremental change. Having led NGOs like Refugees International and the Asia operation of Human Rights Watch, and having led offices and bureaus at the State Department, the National Security Council, and at the UN, also focused on human rights, humanitarian and refugee issues, I suppose I have some experience in the tensions, the challenges, and the opportunities in these areas. And there's no shortage of valuable scholarship, analysis, advocacy, even policy engagement and implementation around transformational change, or change of a thorough or dramatic character to address migration challenges and opportunities. And if a predominant goal is to create conditions that will help to realize basic needs, the well-being, the enjoyment of internationally recognized rights among the many tens of millions of people forced to leave their homes due to conflict, persecution, human rights violations, disasters resulting from natural hazards impacted by climate change, violence perpetrated by non-state actors, and other ills that create what my friend Alex Alenikoff and Leah Zamor have called fleers of necessity. The contours of transformational change are really not wholly unobvious. An international political system that recognizes that people will move across borders, and a willingness to come to recognize and in some cases establish their rights to do so, along with concomitant changes in domestic, legal, and social institutions. Now, the time is particularly ripe for thinking about such change, though I have to acknowledge that this is a statement I would have made at any point over the past 4 decades. According to UNHCR at the end of 2020, there were more than 34 million forced migrants displaced by outside their countries of origin, displaced by persecution, human rights violations, and some 48 million who were internally displaced as a result of conflict and violence. Even in the context of COVID-19, and perhaps especially in the context of the economic downturns that it has created, we see in the Americas not only significant increases in so-called border encounters, as reflected in the blue line on this graph, but also encounters with individuals who are from outside of the Americas. And what we are witnessing in the Americas is indicative of what is happening around the world, an increase in mobility born of state failure, born of violence and deprivation, born of access to information and accessibility of means of transit. And though predictions of climate-based cross-border movements really vary dramatically, we can also expect some degree of such forced migration over the next several years and decades. Now, beyond scholarship, one does not have to look far for evidence of policy engagement around transformational or at least systemic change. In Latin America, there is, of course, the ongoing relevance of the Cartagena Declaration, of 1984 regional declaration that sought to expand the refugee definition to include, among refugees, to protect those who have fled their country due to generalized violence, foreign aggression, internal conflicts, massive violation of human rights, or other circumstances which seriously disturb the public order. And the declaration has been incorporated, if not completely implemented, into the laws of most governments in Latin America. In fact, at Refugees International, we've just issued a report that describes a range of measures taken by Mexico to better realize Cartagena principles, not only in Mexican law, but also in Mexican practice, even as we see simultaneously restrictive practices against asylum seekers in that very same country. Also in the Americas, the efforts of the government of Colombia to provide meaningful opportunities for Venezuelan migrants, well, those efforts have been remarkable. And as we have seen, when rhetoric is reflected in action, strong leaders, even in wealthy countries, where political resistance to immigration is formidable, can be responsible for transformational change. In 2015 and 2016, Germany received about 1 million asylum applications. And as the Center for Global Development recently reported, 5 years later, a majority of the refugees have found jobs, and a relatively high level of engagement on the part of German citizens, engagement with migrants, has helped to create strong support in Germany for refugees. Now, don't get me wrong. I haven't been asleep for the last 2 years. There is plenty of room for pessimism. European governments' practices remain highly restrictive. Turkish officials declared they would reinforce their border wall with Iran to stem potential flow of Afghan refugees, and the externalization of asylum has become common practice. Countries neighboring Colombia have not been nearly as hospitable as Colombia, and even a success story like Uganda, which has done so much to welcome South Sudanese, has closed its border due to COVID-19. Here at home, a Biden-Harris campaign that boasted about plans for dramatic change quickly switched gears, delaying or deferring many, if not most, of the campaign commitments it had made, and now has even seemed to walk back from what it had regarded really as an early signal achievement, the end to President Trump's highly controversial migrant protection protocols. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, our politics at home and politics around the world have become extraordinarily difficult on migration issues, with former President Trump and former officials of his government stoking anti-immigrant sentiment, echoed by chauvinist politicians in countries around the world. And of course, the fact that Customs and Border Patrol encounters have increased significantly, again, with high percentages of individuals from countries other than Mexico and Central America, does not make the challenge any easier. Nonetheless, advocates and many who are here today are rightly asked, how does a new administration lead the world in responding to new migration challenges when it seems to have equivocated at best on commitments made? As a former government official, I have to confess a degree of sympathy, even if I cannot support measures of the new administration. In early 1993, that's a few years ago, after having staffed the Representative Stephen Solar's 1992 effort to seek to reverse George H.W. Bush's Kennebunkport order mandating the direct return of Haitians without screening, I entered the Clinton National Security Council on January 21st, 1993, after the incoming president, in a December meeting in Little Rock, prior to the inauguration, decided to keep the policy in effect for, quote, the time being. Ironically, that was something of a policy win, both for Brian Atwood, who later became USAID administrator, and for me, as we argued successfully against the incoming president declaring that he would keep the policy in effect indefinitely. But the policy of direct return remained in effect until May 1994. And when, in July, as screening at sea was proving unmanageable, and when I and others successfully argued against the resumption of a direct return approach and in favor of a temporary safe haven at Guantanamo, that was also a policy win, supported at the time by a number of NGOs, and frankly, one which I stand by today. But for the most dedicated advocates of protection, those weren't policy wins. They may not even have represented incremental progress. And in my own career in government, there was no shortage of very hard-fought wins that I've regarded as critical for the purpose of protection, but which the advocacy community would have regarded as wholly insufficient. Of course, there is the occasional big one, and anyone serving in government should be prepared to take a stand and be prepared to articulate lines they are not prepared to cross. Here's just one example. I hope not the only one in my career, assistance to newly arriving refugees, where I did, in fact, take such a stance. In fact, anyone serving on the inside should identify lines they will not cross and be prepared to quit. But in or sometimes even outside of government, incremental change or even forestalling the worst is frankly often the best one can do. I was reminded of this last week when the administration, moving toward resumption of the migrant protection protocols, convened the NGO community to brief them about implementation and presumably seek support in efforts to provide at least a modicum of safeguards for the program. The assembled NGOs, including a representative from my own organization, Refugees International, read a statement and then figuratively walked out of that virtual meeting with my support. So what does all this mean for policy analysis, for policy analysts, and for advocates seeking very directly to influence the behavior of governments, especially at this moment in history? I'm afraid I can't offer any surefire answers. I don't have them. And of course, if there were such answers, we would not have quite these challenges or easy answers. But let me suggest a few priorities for those who study and write on migration, for those who try to impact government policy, and even for those who are in governments or international organizations. First, because the most formidable obstacle to transformational change involves domestic politics, the field, analysts, activists, government officials must focus on public engagement and public opinion. There have always been loud voices of intolerance in the United States and beyond, appealing to our fears rather than our hopes and our aspirations. And people ready to blame the other in pursuit of political power. So today we don't have the know-nothing party of the 19th century, demagogues like Charles Edward Coughlin of the early 20th century, who reportedly had tens of millions of followers. Instead, we have Donald Trump, we have Fox News, but we also have new capacities to provide information about the real contributions of immigrants and refugees. The Refugee Advocacy Lab, initiated at Refugees International with partners from the International Rescue Committee and the International Refugee Assistance Project and the Refugee Congress, has sought to build the constituency on behalf of support for refugees, and other initiatives which bear mentioning, including the new Welcome Us effort, these initiatives are doing the same thing. Second, it means targeting. Again, analysts, advocates, and officials focusing on different and in many cases, less partisan policy communities, which unlike national politicians, have to confront day in and day out the realities and the opportunities of immigration. In particular, and as in the case of climate advocacy during the Trump administration, analysts and advocates should support efforts at inclusion at the state and local level. In the Midwest, for example, there is a growing appreciation that migration will be critical to future economic and social development. On the left is a study that was a clarion call for increased labor migration, international immigration as a critical, in fact, the only means to avert dramatic labor shortages in the state of Minnesota. And through the Refugee Advocacy Lab, we have seen legislative victories designed to better meet the needs of refugees, victories often with bipartisan support in places like Nevada, Utah, Virginia, among other states. Third, it means that even as we continue to press, as we should press, US officials on international leadership, we have to recognize and engage leadership, innovation, and best practices from other parts of the world, because much of that now comes from beyond the borders of the United States. To be sure, the US leads on overseas humanitarian and refugee assistance, but all too often, we are not quite practicing at home what we preach abroad. And in many cases, others are now in the lead. Fourth, I think it means first that we should recognize that transformational change in policy on forced migration is rare, unusual if not rare. And we should invest our energy and resources on progress on programs and initiatives, even when it is less than what we ultimately want to envision. Just by way of example, at Refugees International, we are pressing hard on efforts to promote labor market access with rights for refugees in host countries, an initiative that frankly is far more modest than seeking to realize the rights to broader mobility or even citizenship in host countries for forced migrants. Not that those objectives have gone away. Finally, and my broadest recommendation, I suppose, it means that even as advocates and analysts press the United States, other governments, and international organizations on systemic change, we ought to be prepared to work with government officials on, well, something less, with an understanding that something less can become, over time, something more. When the administration was recently returning Haitians, really outrageous under current circumstances, should advocates have pressed harder for some sort of refuge or safe haven option as an alternative to direct return? On a different issue, the administration's recent report on climate and migration, climate and migration, was somewhat disappointing as it was long on description, but short on policy prescription. At the same time, the report did note that the United States, and I quote, has a national interest in creating a new legal pathway for individualized humanitarian protection in the United States for individuals who establish that they are fleeing serious, credible threats to their life or physical integrity. And while that does not, end quote, and while that does not offer concrete recommendations or ideas about what those pathways or other resettlement measures ought to be, it does provide an important opening for both advocates and analysts. So this is not an easy time for international migration advocacy. But that only underscores the importance of the proceedings you're about to begin today, as well as continued efforts to help promote a brighter future for the tens of millions of people around the world who have been forced from their homes. Thank you. And now I am more than happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Eric. I'm trying to look at the questions. Here's one. How do you think about incremental versus transformational change in the context of vaccine equity for migrants and refugees in COVID-19?
I think that's, I actually think that is a far more direct and achievable policy challenge without the political constraints that so many of the other challenges that we now are experiencing have. I think, and I should mention, Refugees International just issued a report on this issue. I think it is unacceptable that the wealthy countries of the world have the capacity, the resources to address this issue very concretely, very straightforwardly, and this is not a failure of transformational of the politics around transformational change. I don't believe. I think it's I think it is it's an abject failure of a willingness on the part of governments to attend to this challenge in a dedicated, systematic way. This is an achievable objective, a very achievable objective on which we are failing. It is not, how do you deal with partisan political conflict where there is a strong divide on policy solutions. I don't think that strong divide exists. I think we have just failed in terms of getting this right.
Here's another question. Can we say that this none of the conditions that we're seeing at the U.S.-Mexico border, the large number of extra-regional migrants coming through, are helped by the broken asylum system at the border? In other words, to what extent would you give credence to the Biden administration's claim that it's inherited really a broken humanitarian and refugee protection system, and that it's very much disabled as a result of that, and responding to what are extraordinarily large numbers of encounters by the Border Patrol at the border?
I think that's true. You don't get to choose when you're an incoming administration. You don't get to choose, the magnitude of the challenges that you are going to have to confront. I think that is a very fair characterization of the situation. And I think, I don't think we and others in the advocacy community have opposed, in principle, the idea of, more, how can I put it, more effective, more efficient, and in many cases, prompter processing, quicker processing of people at the border. I think the difference in terms of the policy perspective has to do with what kinds of due process and procedural safeguards should accompany that, and what use of certain kinds of restrictions, including detention, should accompany those measures. I think that's where the difference is. So I think there's opportunity for productive engagement with the administration on this issue.
What advice would you give to students of forced migration who hope to advocate for transformational change? Does working inside the system have potential, or should they remain on the critical external side of the system?
I confronted this question 2 weeks ago when I taught a course on human rights, migration, and the southern border to some 30 students at the Humphrey School at the University of Minnesota, and I was struck by the difference between the perspectives that the students bring to bear on these issues about and sort of what the political parameters of Washington would permit. And so I think part of our responsibility as educators really is to teach students about those constraints, those limitations, and somehow communicate to them, as I tried to do very explicitly. And I'm going to answer your question in a second. As I tried to do explicitly, that you operate in a constrained environment, and so sometimes you have to make choices that are not the choices you'd want to make, but you have to make them. As long as you never lose, your sense of what the ultimate objective is and ought to be, then then getting your hands dirty, figuratively, is something that that I would strongly recommend for several reasons. Number one, if you're not in there in the discussion about how to deal with alien smuggling, how to deal with issues at the border, if you're not in there with that protection voice, then that protection voice could be lost. That human rights voice could be lost. And secondly, and most importantly, I can tell you quite conclusively that while, without prejudice to people who offer very big ideas, that sort of change our thinking on these issues. And that's extremely important from the outside. In terms of concrete change, there is nowhere that you can have such a significant effect, in a relatively short period of time, other than in government, especially if you're in a reasonably senior position. It's just the way it works. That's where the power is. So I strongly urge my students, who are interested, to think about work in government. Some people can't do it, and I understand that, because it does involve compromises that are sometimes very hard to stomach. But if you can stomach those compromises, you really ought to be on the inside, because you can have a really significant impact on change. The example that I offered today is one. I had to fight for it internally, but ultimately, I made the decision that we were going to double the amount of money we were providing to incoming refugees. And with the stroke of a pen, not even the stroke of a pen, we reallocated $60 million. And you can do that when you're in government. It's harder to do that when you're on the outside.
I think, unfortunately, we're kind of at the end of our time here, but I wanted to thank you for a terrific and thoughtful and perfect kind of introduction to our conference today, Eric, and for your great insights and your great service, both in the private sector now, but also in the public sector for so many years and in so many different positions. So
let me correct you, the nonprofit sector.
Right, excuse me.
Thank you. It's a joy to be in front of so many people whom I know, respect, and have enormous affection for. And I wish you really a wonderful 2 days.
Okay, thank you very much.
Take care. Bye-bye.